The main lesson is that support for reformism, or not even reformism, but bourgeois progressivism, which is usually presented as the lesser evil, it really leads to nowhere. It leads to defeats down the road, and it leads to the growth of far right, the growth of anti-worker and conservative free market neoliberal politics.
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. Argentina has a new president. Sunday, December 10th, was the inauguration of Javier Milei, a far-right libertarian economist. Milei positioned himself during the election as the anti-establishment candidate, while he also advanced a radical neoliberal program. So, for example, he is in favor of drastically cutting the state and even actually outright eliminating several ministries, like the Ministry of Women, Equality, and Diversity. He even proposed eliminating the central bank of Argentina. He's anti-abortion, he's a climate change denier, he is advocating a sort of shock therapy for the Argentinian economy and austerity for workers. Milei didn't come out of nowhere. Although he has some, shall we say, interesting proposals that put him on the map and got him a lot of attention, even internationally, we need to understand the broader context of his election. Specifically, we need to understand his election as an expression of widespread popular discontent with the political establishment and with the two parties that have ruled Argentina for the past 2 decades. So why this discontent? Well, Argentina is experiencing a protracted economic and political crisis. Inflation is above 140%. That makes it one of the highest inflation rates in the world. And at least 40% of the population lives in poverty. That is a 4-fold increase in poverty in just the past 6 years. At the same time, multi-million-dollar mega profits from booming industries like lithium extraction and agribusiness, they flow to corporations, especially to foreign multinationals. Instead of increasing social spending, the government is paying off debts to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And actually next year, around $20 billion will go towards servicing Argentina's IMF debt. These are the crises that the outgoing government of Alberto Fernandez and Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner has refused to tackle. In fact, during the election, despite some rhetorical differences, none of the establishment candidates really offered an alternative. Instead, they all effectively promised more austerity, more extraction of natural resources, and more attacks on workers. They would effectively keep the country's labor force and resources open to and subservient to imperialist exploitation. As my guest will describe today, all these candidates ultimately had to offer during this election, in the face of Milei's reactionary candidacy, was lesser evilism. This might sound familiar, and we will certainly be drawing some instructive parallels during this episode. The party that did offer an alternative was the PTS, or Party of Socialist Workers, and the Workers' Front Unity Coalition that they were a part of. It was headed by Miriam Bregman and Nicolás del Caño. They put forward a complete break with the IMF and financial imperialism. They advocated funding social services like healthcare, education, and housing programs, and the nationalization of natural resources. They actually got 800,000 votes and 5 members of the National Congress, and they are, of course, continuing to put up a real fight for the working class. We will definitely cover the PTS more in a future episode. To discuss this today, I'm joined by my comrade, Juan Ferre. Juan is a contributor and member of Left Voice. He is a medical doctor and sociologist and a postdoctoral fellow in the program in Latin American Studies at Princeton University. Before moving to the US, Juan was a member of the PTS and he worked as a physician at a public hospital in Argentina. In addition to explaining the factors that led to Milei's rise and victory, Juan describes the parallels that this movement has with previous political eras in Argentina. Most importantly, though, we discuss the importance of organizing an independent, working-class resistance to Milei, and linking this to a revolutionary struggle against capitalism and imperialism. And we, of course, talk about the lessons that we can learn internationally, like here in the US. Before we start, just a very quick note about terminology that we use in this episode. Juan talks a lot about Peronism, so I wanted to just take a moment to explain what we mean by that. Peronism has been the most influential political movement in Argentina since the mid-20th century. The term comes from President Juan Perón, and because he gave concessions to the working class, incorporating and co-opting the labor movement in the 1940s and the 1950s, Peronism has historically counted on the support of unions and the majority of the working class. But its politics are bourgeois nationalist, and within the umbrella of Peronism, so to speak, there is a variety of politicians from the center-left, like the Kirchnerists, who we also talk about today. They're named after Nestor Kirchner, the president from 2003 to 2007, to the center-right and neoliberal proponents. Sergio Massa, who we talk a lot about in this episode as well, he ran against Javier Milei in the runoff election, and he was a Peronist candidate. If you want to support Left Voice and this podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/leftvoice. We are on social media using the handle @left_voice and on TikTok as Left Voice, all in one word. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends, family, coworkers, comrades, and it always helps to leave us a nice little review wherever you get your podcasts. Here's my interview with Juan. Juan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Since he was elected recently, I think more and more people in the US have heard of Javier Milei. If nothing else, he is pretty notable for his hairstyle, his appearance. From what I've seen in recent weeks, he and Elon Musk seem to have a very fitting bromance happening, so not very surprising. But to get us started in this conversation, before we really dig in deep to the context and things like that, could you tell me a little bit about Javier Milei? Who is he? What's his background? What are his overall political views?
Yeah, Javier Milei is a libertarian economist, follower of the Austrian school, Friedrich Hayek, von Mises, and also follower of a rather obscure character in American economics and politics. He's called Murray Rothbard, also part of the Austrian school. He's the one who came up first with this idea of anarcho-capitalism that Javier Milei identifies himself with. And Milei, well, he became known in Argentina for his participation in talk shows, being a rather explosive and revulsive character, shouting and being very expressive and angry and all that. And people didn't really take him seriously for a long time. Then 2 years ago, he ran for office and he won a seat in Congress. And that was the launching of his career. So he's pretty new to the political party system in Argentina. He's a real outsider. And I would say that there are three components of Milei's discourse. One, which is probably the most appealing one, is the anti-caste rhetoric that he uses. He is an outsider, and he's been denouncing the political caste all along since the beginning of his appearances in TV, denouncing both of the predominant parties at that time, the Peronist or Kirchnerist, Unidos por la Patria, and also Juntos por el Cambio, the center-right party of Mauricio Macri. Another main component is the anti-right rhetoric, anti-human rights. He's a denialist of the genocide that happened in Argentina under the last dictatorship. He opposes abortion rights. He's pro-life. He made some really absurd, ridiculous remarks about setting up a market for the sale of human organs. He even said he would be open to selling and buying children. That was probably at the peak of his campaign, when he took a hit for all these comments that he made. And he's also a climate change denialist, right? So that's another, we would say, another leg of his identity and discourse that appeals a certain kind of people to. It's not that these three components appeal. It's a coherent voting base. And the third one is a radical free market discourse, right? Including a drastic reduction of the state, labor reform, flexibilization, erosion of workers' rights. He talked about eliminating the central bank, which would obviously mean the elimination of the peso, the national currency, and the dollarization of the economy. And he boasted his program about eliminating multiple ministries and these, what he considers an overgrown state. He talked about eliminating plenty of ministries, like the women and diversity ministry, environmental ministry, culture, even education. Now, after he won the election, he has, and particularly after the first round, he backtracked from many of his claims. But originally, that's sort of his complete discourse.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about the context of his rise. So, in your answer just now, you're saying that there are some things about his candidacy that appeal to certain sectors. I mean, perhaps not necessarily the more outrageous stuff about selling children and human organs, which I hadn't heard about, but is really incredible to hear. But certainly, as you were saying, the fact that he was an outsider. But obviously, as we always say, for example, on the podcast, and especially as leftists and materialists, we know that politicians like Milei don't come completely out of nowhere. It's not an accident or kind of out of the blue that he rose to prominence or that he won this election. What are the bigger contextual factors that led to his popularity and ultimately to his election?
Yeah, I think there's probably a temptation, and many mainstream media, international media are celebrating Milei's victory and interpreting it as a shift to the right in politics and in public opinion. And I think we need to be very careful about that, because, as you said, the context is really important. And I would say there are two main reasons in the historical context why that can explain the rise of Javier Milei. And one is the protracted economic downturn of the country. Since 2013, there's been sluggish economic growth, worsening of public services, increase in poverty. Today, we have 140% of inflation, which means, for any working class person, that means that the money you get paid at the beginning of the month, then it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't buy anything by the end of the month. Like almost half the country is in poverty. So those are really clear components of the economic crisis that leads to many people to seek new political alternatives, right? Like the immediate conclusion is, okay, what the two parties that have been ruling the country for the past 15 years, or at least the past 10 years, haven't really resolved the situation. So we need to look somewhere else. So the economic situation that it's combined with the second big and related problem, which is the lack of, or the crisis of representation, the crisis of legitimacy of the political system itself. And I think that's why the anti-caste rhetoric that he put forward had so much traction and so much popularity. I think that alone can explain a great part of his popularity and the vote. So we need to remember that Kirchnerism, which is the leading faction within Peronism, Kirchnerism took office in 2003 after a really huge economic and social crisis and political crisis.
This is Nestor Kirchner, the first Kirchner, and
Correct.
not Christina that you're referring to.
Right. Nestor Kirchner took office in 2003, then Christina followed him. They ruled the country between 2003 and 2015, right? And they gave concessions, and there was a limited expansion of social rights. There was economic recovery. This is all what was in response to the huge mass mobilizations that rejected neoliberalism and austerity policies in the 1990s, right? The chant in the street was everyone must go, que se vayan todos. And so that was a huge crisis of legitimacy, and the response of the political system was Kirchnerism. Now, after 2011, 2013, after the global financial crisis started to hit Argentina, well, things changed, and Kirchnerism moderated a lot its economic policy. Juntos por el Cambio, the center-right coalition, took office in 2015, between 2015 and 2019, and then Peronism took office again in 2019 until now, right? Now, it's not just that conditions on the ground have been worsening on and on, not just with the center-right coalition, but also Kirchnerism and Peronism itself has been shifting more and more to the right, or to the center, if you want. The coalition that ran for office in these last elections put forward Sergio Massa as the presidential candidate, which is probably as far right as you can go within Peronism. It's like a very clear sign of shifting to the right within the coalition. So from the campaign and from the more progressive fractions of Kirchnerism, the idea or the discourse in the campaign was, we need to avoid getting Macri elected or getting Milei elected at any cost. Even Sergio Massa is great. And that was something that people really didn't buy it. It was like, oh, no, this is not going anywhere. Massa his nickname is born the 4th of July. So that's how close he is to U.S. imperialism, the U.S. embassy. He's been known to advance anti-worker policies and pro-security. And so this was the proposal of progressivism that people really didn't buy.
Basically, they had this argument of lesser evilism.
Correct. Yeah.
That you should vote for Massa because he's the lesser evil compared to Milei, and you should, continue the same course of Kirchnerism and Peronism because it's the lesser evil.
Yeah, exactly. And let's remember also that Milei was recognized or interpreted by both the Peronist coalition, Massa, and the Juntos por el Cambio, center-right coalition, as instrumental to their victory, what they thought was their victory. They thought they were the main two contenders. They didn't take Milei seriously, so they lift him up, not just giving him space to put forward his program, but also Massa supported financially Milei's candidacy, Milei's campaign. Massa gave candidates for Milei because, he's so new to politics. He didn't have the party structure. So many candidates for local office to fill in a full slate were borrowed from Massa. So that's one of the key reasons why he was able to rise as a really important competitive contender in these elections. And also he had the support of much of the mainstream media, who was interested in shifting the political debate to the right. And also he was very close to one of the main owners of a broadcasting company, America, a right-wing guy that also was instrumental in setting him up as a good candidate. There is also an element of a backlash against women's rights, LGBTQ rights, environmental rights. human rights. It's really not well known. It's difficult to tell to what extent his voting base agrees with this part of his discourse. It seems to be that more the anti-caste part of his discourse is what really drives much of the people, and his proposed drastic solution to inflation, which is what people understand when he talked about dollarization. Well, those are the two main reasons why his popularity was enough to get him to office. But there is also a narrower voting base that is really, has really found his grievance against all this progressive rhetoric and advancing human rights and gender rights and so on, and is really part of a growing far-right movement, if you want.
So I'm really intrigued by what you've been saying about the fact that Milei was kind of proposing a sort of alternative to politics as usual. And you've been mentioning some of these parties also that uplifted Milei and who he was running against ultimately, like Massa, he was running against in the runoff election in particular. So fast forwarding a little bit to the present day and the events of the past month, let's talk a little bit more in depth about the actual election. So who were the other candidates running against Milei? And I mean, you've kind of answered this question already, so this is extremely leading, but were they providing any sort of alternative to what he was proposing?
Yeah, the main candidates were for the Juntos por el Cambio center-right coalition. It was Patricia Bullrich, and Unidos por la Patria, which is Peronism, was Sergio Massa. Within Peronism, we have to also understand that Peronism is not a democratic organization by any means. There's always a leading faction, leading wing, and the leading wing within Peronism has been since 2003 has been Kirchnerism, and the main, maker behind the scenes of the main person who appoints now who's going to run is Cristina Kirchner, Fernandez de Kirchner, at this point. So we need to understand Massa as the proposer of Kirchnerism to win these elections. So, and also some compromise in a way between Kirchnerism and other wings of Peronism. It was known that if Cristina herself had run, she wouldn't have won. She had too much of a negative image, negative public opinion against her. But all this to say, well, these are the two main parties that have been ruling the country for the past 10 years. And then there was the far-right Milei with La Libertad Avanza, Liberty Advances. And there was the left coalition, the Workers' Left Front Unity, of which the PTS, the Partido de Trabajadores Socialistas, our sister organization, was part of and provided the main candidates, the presidential candidate Miriam Bregman and vice presidential candidate Nicolás del Caño. And between the main three contenders, the ones that had basically almost a third of the vote, each 30% each, there wasn't really that much of a difference in the program. There was a difference in discourse and in progressive rhetoric, mostly from Unión por la Patria and from Massa. Not because Massa was very progressive, but he had the base of more left wings in Peronism and the support of Kirchnerism. So he had to speak to that base, and he had to give enough reason for that base to campaign for him. Yeah, but despite those differences in detail and rhetoric, they really had a lot in common. Like they all proposed the need of an immediate tightening of the belt, austerity, cutbacks to social spending and public spending. They all had in mind for immediate future anti-worker programs. Like I'm thinking about Massa, who should be the one opposing that, and he openly spoke against teachers' strikes, for example, saying things like party is over. We're not going to allow any more strikes in the public sector. He spoke openly against roadblocks and protests and the need to bring order. One of the main proposals that he put forward as a way out of the crisis for Argentina was squarely within the path of extractivism. He said, we have what we need to get out. We have gas, we have lithium. That was the opening of his campaign clip, right? For the general elections. So to me, it was very clear that he represented no alternative to the others. Said similar things, but it was expected from a center-right coalition or a far-right candidate who is proposing, liberalizing the economy, the free market, privatizations, and all that. Well, there were those slight differences. Milei's discourse was more reminiscent of shock therapy, right? Of a full privatization of public services and all that. This common ground among the three center and center-right candidates stands in stark contrast with what the Workers' and Left Front was proposing, which was a complete break with the IMF, the refusal to pay foreign debt, and with those funds that usually go to foreign debt that are like a really heavy drain on the economy, they were proposing to fund really strong and high quality healthcare, education, a massive housing program. Another key proposal was the reduction of working hours to 6 hours a day for 5 days a week with no reduction in pay, which would immediately generate millions of jobs and address unemployment. And also another very clear distinction and difference was the opposition to extractivism, the proposal to nationalize natural resources under workers' control and under the control of indigenous communities living in the territory, which is something that, of course, none of these other parties was proposing, because they want to generate the friendly business environment for multinational companies to come and plunder the resources and generate some economic growth. But really, all these extractivist activities generate very little employment. They leave horrible environmental conditions. They have a huge impact on indigenous peoples, on communities living there, and so on. So
yeah, and certainly not a break with imperialism.
Absolutely not a break at all with the influence and the program that fits right in with imperialist needs and goals.
Something I've been reading, especially from our comrades in Argentina, is that we've seen some aspects of this situation before. More specifically, what some people are arguing is that this moment and Milei himself have some similarities from a previous period in Argentinian politics, which was the 1990s presidency of Carlos Menem. You even referred actually earlier to the context of the 1990s and 2001. Can you speak a little bit more about this parallel?
Yeah, the parallel is very clear. Milei is proposing shock therapy, austerity, drastic reduction of the state, liberalization of prices, flexibilization of labor law, etc., etc. And this was already done by Carlos Menem in the 90s. And he himself recognized that. He said he was a Menemist. He was a Menem follower in some way, which is something really weird to say in Argentina, because the public opinion about Menem for the past 20 years has been really terrible, very, very much stacked against him. But, it's a sign that a new generation that wasn't exposed to the 90s now is a political actor, and it's voting and is relevant in the elections. And it's also a sign of the crisis and the organic crisis, and the crisis of representation of the parties that came after. Now, it's interesting to note also that the anti-caste rhetoric that Milei used, he borrowed this idea that I was mentioning today about que se vayan todos, everyone must go, in the 2001 uprising. He used that, and many of his rallies featured, or included moments where he encouraged and his supporters chanted que se vayan todos, everyone must go, which is the origins is anti-neoliberalism and anti-Menem, but he's using that to criticize or blast what he called the political caste and propose a program that is very similar to Menem's. So those are some contradictions or paradoxes of this moment in Argentina. Now, there are some key differences between Carlos Menem and Milei and the feasibility in implementing such a program. And maybe I would say one of the main ones is that Carlos Menem won the elections with much more support than Milei. Let's remember that Milei had 30% of vote in the general election. Then, in the runoff, he got 55% against Sergio Massa, but, those are not all his votes of his own. Much of it is borrowed from mostly from the center-right coalition Juntos por el Cambio. The other thing is that Carlos Menem had a huge party structure. He was a part of the Peronist coalition. So he had governors in all the provinces. He had technocrats and people to fill all the cabinet. That's not the case of Milei. And, being the leader of the Peronist party also gives you a direct connection and an implicit alliance with the labor federations, who did not really oppose a concerted and strong fight against neoliberalism in Carlos Menem's presidency. Only they opposed specific reforms that they were able to block, because they are really strong federations when they mobilize. But, they conceded a great deal, and it's not clear what's going to happen ahead. That's one of the things that is uncertain. Those are some of the difference between Milei and maybe another difference is the international context. In the 90s, neoliberalism was in full swing, and Reagan, Thatcher, and all this "there's no alternative" rhetoric had a lot of popularity and legitimacy, and there was very little opposition to that. Today, that's not the case, even though we see a failure and we see a retreat of Keynesian politics and what we could call progressive politics, particularly in Latin America. Well, things are not really clear, and we can't say that neoliberalism or neoliberal politics have regained legitimacy among the population.
Yeah, let's get into a little bit what we do think that his presidency is going to look like, because he is taking power on Sunday, December 10th. And I was curious about what his cabinet looks like, what his policy proposals look like. And yeah, how do you envision his presidency going, or his regime?
Well, the first thing to say here is that his initial plan, and still his plan now, although it's been moderated a great deal, but it's a declaration of war against the working class. It includes the devaluation of the peso, which would lead immediately, with the liberalization of prices, to inflation and to erosion of wages, right? The income of working class people is going to get a hit, really hard hit, in the first months at least. It includes austerity, cutbacks to education, healthcare, most social programs. It includes massive layoffs in the public sector. It includes labor reform and privatization, although now he's backtracking slightly from that. He's He says it's not going to be immediate, that we're going to leave that for a second stage, but that's part of his program too. So the reality is that there is going to be class struggle. That's in the immediate horizon, and there's going to be resistance. The question is what resistance there's going to be, and his bet is that he's going to be able to win terrain for, let's call it, terrain for the capitalist class and for market forces, right? There is a certain level of social rights and workers' rights that have been conquered, historic from the 20th century, and also some more recent as a concession from the Kirchnerists, as I was saying today, for concession to mass mobilizations and workers' power, etc. Well, he's gonna try to alter that. He's gonna try to modify that relation of forces, but that's not gonna happen without a defeat. There's going to be a struggle, class struggle, and there's going to be either resistance, and he's gonna have to back down. It's good to remember that Macri attempted something like this in 2017. Two years after he took office, he tried two things. One, pension reform, and the second, labor reform. And labor reform was rejected immediately. The two main labor federations at that time threatened to go on a general strike, and he backed down immediately because he knew he was going to lose. The pension reform passed, but it was a Pyrrhic kind of victory. He was able to pass the reform, which was a relatively minor reform, but like a conservative reform, but it was at a really high political cost. So that was kind of drawing the limits. Class struggle was what draw the limit for Macri's neoliberal program. So we're going to see another episode of that fight. It's really open what's going to happen. He seems to be determined. There is a lot of conflation in what his mandate is, because he and his team of people and much of the mainstream media are saying, well, his mandate, people voted him to pass austerity policies, to pass a flexibilization of the labor law, but that's not really clear that that's the case. I would argue it's not, actually. He has only 30% of the vote, and out of that 30% of the vote, many of those voted him for his anti-caste rhetoric, not really to get a hit in his income, to get a reduction of workers' rights or social rights or social spending in any way. So we'll see how that plays out really in the immediate future. He has some weaknesses at the time, in the pursuit of this program, which is he has no party structure. He has very slim quantity of seats in Congress. The lower house, he has only 39 seats out of 257. So he's gonna have to build coalitions with other parties, and he's doing that already. He's been appointing leaders of different parties to the cabinet in order to form those coalitions that would allow him to govern, basically would give him what's usually called governability. Like he has appointed Luis Caputo, who's former finance minister of Mauricio Macri, Patricia Bullrich, the candidate that ran against him in the general elections, who's also a member, obviously, of Juntos por el Cambio. She's going to be the Minister of Security. Guillermo Francos is a longtime Peronist. He's going to be the Ministry of the Interior. He's going to play the role of link between his presidency and the governors that hold an important portion of power in many ways. So he's trying to build that coalition already. So, but we'll see how really that plays out. It will be in the field of class struggle really what will set the limits of his program, his actual program.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about what the terrain is or what the tasks are for the left in Argentina going forward and how they can capitalize on this moment of hopefully increased class struggle. How would you say that the left in Argentina and the PTS in particular have responded? What are they putting forward?
The task of the day is to organize the resistance, right? I think great part of the left in Argentina was co-opted into the Kirchner's coalition in the early 2000s and 2010s. So part of the left needs to relearn how to go out in the streets and fight. Needs to relearn how to not rely on the government and government support and institutions and respectability politics, and really build class struggle and fight within their organizations and fight for a really working class independent program, right? So that's going to be the main task, and the PTS and the Workers' Left Front has been pushing for that, and it's a recognized voice for working class politics and workers' struggle from many years. So the conflict, class struggle, labor unrest, that's going to happen. Social movements, mobilization, that's going to happen. The key is how the resistance really is organized. And it's going to be a moment of coming to terms with existing leaderships that have conceded and have been proposing class coalitions and concessions to employers and concessions to the government. And I think to a great extent, we're going to see changes in those leaderships, the leaderships of unions. Hopefully we'll see that, where more radical and more left organizations or slates within unions are going to win the upper hand, and they're going to be able to have a stronger influence on how really workers and unions, workers' organizations lead the fight against austerity and against the government. The left has working class left, independent left. The PTS in particular has some really important leaders that have been in the fight in the unions, proposing working class perspective, anti-coalition politics with bourgeois politicians, with employers, and that's going to be important in leading the way into a new generation or a new episode of class struggle. I think the attacks against public education, against workers' rights, against public health, that's going to be an opportunity for the left to advance a united front where different workers' organizations fight together, maintaining political independence. For example, if Kirchnerist or pro-Kirchner labor leaders or unions want to go on a fight with independent working class or revolutionary militants, they're going to fight in the united front, but keeping very clear political distinctions and a very clear negative balance sheet of the experience of Kirchnerism outside and inside government. So that's going to be key in clarifying not only the program and the methods of class struggle, but also the path forward in terms of revolutionary politics and independent working class politics.
This conversation has been really interesting from the perspective of what the tasks are ahead for the left and for the working class in Argentina. But zooming out a little bit, I do think also that this has a lot of things we can learn and a lot of kind of takeaway messages more for the international left also and for the US. So what do you think are the lessons that this situation holds for the international left? And is there any lesson we can take away for US politics as well?
The main lesson is that support for reformism, or not even reformism, but bourgeois progressivism, which is usually presented as the lesser evil, it really leads to nowhere. It leads to defeats down the road, and it leads to the growth of far right, the growth of anti-worker and conservative free market neoliberal politics. Because the reality, and this is a clear parallel between progressivism within the Democratic Party here in the US and progressivism in Argentina or in any of the Latin American countries that had this center left or pink tide governments. There is always a huge distance between the rhetoric of advancing workers' rights, people's rights in any way, indigenous rights, the environment, etc. They all say they are for it, right? They all say we are the champions of workers' rights, of LGBTQ rights, environmental rights. Yet, after winning office, Biden allows drilling for oil in the Arctic. And similarly, in Argentina, Sergio Massa, Kirchnerism, the Peronism, is supposedly the defenders of environment and indigenous rights, but they open all that terrain to the extraction of lithium, and they repress indigenous activists and environmental activists. Like, there are many environmental activists that have been killed in the past few years by both governments, the center-right Juntos por el Cambio, but also Peronist governments. And the same happens with, you name it, public services, healthcare. Oh, we defend the public hospital, but they're really defunding it. And so what people get is really low quality. It's a shell of public services. It's not really what they are. So the natural consequence of that is that working class people on the ground say, no, I don't want that. I don't want public hospital, because public hospital is a piece of crap. I have to wait 20 hours to get, assistance. They have nothing to give me, drugs or medicines or anything. So same with education, right? We are for public education, but at the same time, they're defunding it. So there are so many problems of infrastructure, of lack of resources, etc. And so I think it's very important to have political independence, because it's not about defending, or it's not about supporting their program. Workers' rights and indigenous rights and all that, we are for it. We're not far left militants that want only communism and nothing less than that, and anything else is worthless. No, we fight for all those demands, for all those rights today. We need to fight for those, not only because it's just and we want that now, but also because it increases our power and organizing capacity to fight for more, to fight for socialism. But the truth is, supporting Democrats or supporting Kirchnerism doesn't lead there. It only delegitimizes a discourse and a program for emancipation, for liberation, for workers' rights, for people of color's rights, for indigenous peoples, for the environment. And it really, in the end, it undermines our capacity to put forward a program that really distinguishes itself from everyday, the misery of capitalism that we face every day.
I think that's a really beautiful place to end the conversation. Juan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.